My name is Kristen Hoskins, and I'm the curator of lectures, courses, and concerts. And it's my honor to welcome you to today's talk, Revolution and Upheaval in Kahlo's Mexico, presented by Benjamin Johnson, assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Professor Johnson received his BA from Northwestern University and PhD from the University of Chicago in the Department of History. Professor Johnson researches and teaches about Latin America and its wider connections. His research investigates local politics in central Mexico after the Spanish invasions of the 16th century, particularly the emergence and functioning of unofficial patterns of order. He's also interested in the process of informal association in 19th century Brazil. Professor Johnson teaches introductory classes in Latin America and world history, as well as specialized courses on the pre-Columbian Americas, comparative colonialisms, and historical methods. His current book project, Pueblos Within Pueblos, I'm going to say this horribly, I'm sorry, Tlaxcali Communities in Acalhuacan, Mexico, 1272 to 1692, will be coming out in fall of 2017 and will offer a new vision of social and political change after the fall of the Aztec Triple Alliance. Please join me in welcoming Professor Johnson.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. It's a real honor and pleasure. I really want to thank the MFA for the chance to come here and explore my obsessions and yours, Frida Kahlo, and generally, more broadly, questions of upheaval, revolution, order, and culture in Mexico. As she mentioned, my specialty is, in fact, the Aztec Empire and the early Spanish period. So it's something of an honor to be able to talk about the very interesting transformations in more modern Mexico. I'm actually going to begin, if you'll allow me this indulgence, to talk about some of the much deeper connections that are filaments that maybe not that aren't we can't draw exact causal correlation, a line of inference from one to the other to the other to the other. It's rather a recurring pattern of Mexican culture, I would say, that goes quite deep. And in fact, I'm starting with this photo of Frida Kahlo and her two associates with just a little picture of the pyramids of Teotihuacan just past. And one of the things that from Teotihuacan forward, I would say, in central Mexico, there's a pattern of, if you will, the foreign becoming local and the local becoming foreign. I'm going to give a few examples of this. It should be clear as well that this, I think, is one of the key themes in Frida Kahlo's work. A daughter of a German immigrant and a local Mexican daughter exploring and recreating Mexican myths in the 20th century. This is certainly a very modern undertaking by Kahlo and her colleagues. And I really commend the museum for its new gallery up on the third floor, the Americas exhibit. But it also goes very, very, very deep, back to Teotihuacan, for example. A classic civilization, the largest city certainly in the Americas during this period, second only perhaps to the city of China during its height, in sort of the mid-centuries of the first millennium after the Common Era, after Christ. One example of this that comes very early on is a cultural group, a minority group within Teotihuacan. Does everyone have a little sheet? This might be helpful because some of the words are a little bit complicated. Tlailotlacan is the name of this neighborhood. And it's originally, it's assigned ethnicity, its assigned region of origin is from Oaxaca, farther south in Mexico. And the interesting thing about the story of Tlailotlacan, it, by the way, is a Tlaxcaltecali community. It's one of the things I talk about in my book, but that's another point. The glyph for Tlailotlacan here is a curving path. Tlailotlacan means the place of the people who returned. And the idea of Tlailotlacan is, in fact, people migrating out of central Mexico, spending various centuries in Oaxaca, absorbing much of Oaxacan culture, and then returning. So they're migrants, but they're foreigners, but they're also local. And we see this consistently in cities, not just Teotihuacan, but across Mesoamerica, where we have neighborhoods consisting of foreigners, speaking different languages, wearing different clothes, worshiping different gods, and trying to accommodate a very, very uncomfortable diversity within oftentimes a quite bustling and busy and conflictive cityscape. So just to recap, this is sort of the ceramic work of folks in Tlaxcala. This is the glyph. This is from a much later codex. Jumping forward to the Aztec period, the stories, I don't know if anyone is familiar at all with Aztec stories of migration. Aztec is a 19th century term popularized by the Boston historian William Prescott. It's a shop-worn term, but it's also very useful precisely because of its only tenuous connection to the ethnic terms that people in central Mexico were using during the time of the Aztec period. It's useful precisely because it's artificial. Aztec that was a term that was used, but it certainly wasn't the ethnic term that people used. And it refers, of course, to this mythic homeland of Aztlan, referencing a series of migrations of folks from the north. Aztlan has been cited in various different places. I'm not going to get into that debate. But the arrival of foreigners to central Mexico who then rise to power and begin to assimilate local culture is, in a sense, the founding myth of the Aztec Empire. Not only that, there's minorities all over this community. This is what I work on. This is sort of the documents I frequently submerge myself in. And it's really interesting. This is a minor Aztec deity called Amimit, right over here. This is from an early Spanish codex, of course. Much of the documentation from the pre-Columbian period in central Mexico was lost for various fires emerging from various patterns of invasion, Spanish, Tlaxcalteca, and otherwise. The thing that's interesting about Amimit is there's a little prayer that the Spanish priest recorded down here to Amimit. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Cotiwana, Cotiwana, Kalitoto, Tinacan, Wayayaya. The thing that's interesting here, the reason I was stumbling with this language is because I speak Nahuatl. It's a research language, and it's still spoken by millions of folks in Mexico. The marginal note here, this is the note in Nahuatl, is saying this is a language that I don't understand. It's the Chichimec language, the dog people of the north, and this is my best attempt to capture the syllables of here. I don't know what it means. It's not in our native language of Nahuatl. It's in Chichimec. Nevertheless, here's the prayer. Interestingly, especially given the lack of precision in the textual quotation of this prayer, the graphic ascription is spot on. Every single thing up here on top is describing one aspect of his plastic array. The hunting basket, the feathered crown, the charcoal stripes down the legs, the paper sash. All of these things are very, very spot on representationally. And I think this is very interesting if we think about the difference between language, spoken language and recorded language, and a wider visual language that the museum here, for example, traffics in, that Frida Kahlo traffics in as well. So it might be secondary that the prayer here is misquoted or is just a bunch of gobbledygook that people don't understand in the Chichimec dog language, because what really matters is how Amimit looks and how he presents himself right there. Jumping forward, another group of foreigners who arrived quite boisterously in central Mexico is, of course, Spaniards and others. The Tlaxcalteca were mortal enemies and supplied the infantry, basically, that overthrew the Aztec Empire. Africans were there from the very, very, very beginning. And, of course, Spaniards themselves were in an ongoing process of negotiating new culture in central Mexico. Sometimes a term that is used that is something like transculturation, where there's a little bit here, a little bit there. This is a static process, however, that a term like transculturation would suggest, and rather it's a much more dynamic, experiment-based, I would say, approach. If anyone is familiar at all with the intellectual history of the last 500 years of the Americas, you might be familiar with Sir Juan Inés de la Cruz, scientist, poet, nun, who was based in Mexico, one of the things that she did was write a series of plays where she takes the voice, she incorporates the voice of various social types. There's an ongoing scholarly debate to what extent this is more a sarcastic and parodical appropriation, or to what extent it's a more sincere attempt at representation. For my purposes here, it's really beside the point. We have here, for example, in one of Sor Juana's plays, a series of voices. I only cited a few here, of someone from Puerto Rico supposedly speaking in a more, let's say, African-based intonation pattern, talking about this obscure Catholic saint, St. Pedro Nolasco, who was responsible for ransoming slaves in Moorish Spain. Tumba la la la, tumba le le le, donde apilico esclava no quede. Tumba tumba le le le, tumba la la la, donde apilico no quede esclava. So it's an attempt to broaden the spoken repertoire of the performance that she's orchestrating. Similarly, we have something called a tocotín, which is a mix of Spanish and Nahuatl language phrasing. También un topil del gobernador caipampa tributo prender me mandó. Mas yo con un cuahuitl, un palo le dio, y pa insonteco, no sé si murió. It's the story, these are little humorous anecdotes. The second one is a story about a local indigenous person who speaks a little bit of Spanish, a little bit of Nahuatl, and when the local tribute collector comes, he decides to give him a whack on the head with a big stick. Cuahuitl in Nahuatl is stick. And so I gave him a big stick on the head, and I don't know if he's dead or not. Again, an idea of foreign and local beginning to interpenetrate in very, very, very interesting ways. We see this in Teotihuacan. We see this in the Spanish colonial period. Our fine collections here at the MFA have these Costa paintings, these both slightly playful, slightly sarcastic, certainly prejudicial, but also quite beautiful attempts to imagine social types. This was, of course, before Linnaean biology, so people were trying to figure out, at least elites who were commissioning these paintings, were trying to figure out how you get the various panoply of colors that they might see in the street or among their service staff. So the question of albinism, for example, is an ongoing question in these Costa paintings. Oftentimes, they have the scientific formula up here. And it's actually, I should have gotten a different one. This one's a bit hard to read. I hope that the idea is clear, of foreigners becoming local and of locals beginning to play around with the idea of foreignness. I should say here, I was going to say this during the section about Sor Juana, that in the text that I work with, Nahuatl language texts, we also see ongoing remarks about about foreigners arriving in indigenous communities. So there was a mission from Japan in the 1630s that arrived, for example, and one local chronicler was describing the gigantic size of the kitana blade that the ambassador was carrying in his very, very, very long hair, and imagining what it would be like why an ambassador would have to carry such a gigantic long blade to come and sort of re-up diplomatic relations between the viceroyal government in Mexico and various places in Japan. Likewise, after an uprising of free and unfree Africans in Mexico, this same chronicler was imagining what it would be like to be, instead of ruled by Spaniards, to be ruled by an African king and queen. These are I think it's a very multitudinous imaginary landscape that people, particularly in this region of central Mexico, inhabit, recreate, and play with over very, very, very long periods of time. I had mentioned at an earlier slide the idea of Tlaxcala, of folks from Oaxaca arriving in the center and mixing things up. Certainly, another example, moving much more forward chronologically in time, we have the story of someone like Benito Juarez, the famous 19th century president of Mexico, perhaps the most revered Mexican president down until today, grew up speaking Zapotec and not Spanish. And the ongoing story of his acculturation into a dominant culture is one that's, I think, prime in the 19th century history of Mexico, precisely because once once Juarez becomes powerful, rises to control the ruling coalition in Mexico, he begins to promulgate a series of reforms attempting precisely to force indigenous communities, for one reason or another, to disentail themselves from old cultural patterns and to begin to experiment and recreate forms of Mexican modernity. This could be European inflected, it might not be. His rival and successor, Porfirio Diaz, and this is where we're really starting to get into the story as well of the early biography and pre-biography of Frida Kahlo. Porfirio Diaz, shown here as a strapping young man. A similar story to Benito Juarez in many ways. Also with an indigenous background, although he grew up speaking Spanish as opposed to Juarez's Zapotec. But once he arrived at the pinnacle, first of military power, and then after a contested election, presidential power, you see here on the note, this is the beginning of something called the Porfiriato. It's over a 30-year period where Porfirio Diaz is basically the main leader in charge. And the idea of playing with local and foreign, of in and out, is also present during the reign of Porfirio. He, like many people in the 19th century, regardless of their skin tone, are powdering their faces white so that they can look more romantic or stately or for whatever reason. Meanwhile, his wife is dressing up as some sort of indigenous costumed hunter for balls and other get-togethers. This is a period when Mexico is starting to become much more prominent on the world stage. It's beginning to participate in Anglo-European, or sort of North American, European patterns of international presentation, things like World's Fairs. It's during the Porfirian regime where Mexico starts to fashion an exportable image of itself and to play around with that. Part of this idea of defining what a modern Mexico would look like is certainly using the now increasingly prevalent, it's incredible how fast photography spreads across Mexico once it arrives. Whether it's either photographic or landscape or portrait photography, it's exploding across Mexico at this time. Again, an attempt to focus, to highlight what Mexico means to this ruling elite. One of the most important photographers here, as you might see in my lead-up, was this dashing German immigrant, Guillermo Kahlo, Frida Kahlo's dad, and pictured here with his second wife, Matilde Calderón. This, of course, is also replayed in Frida Kahlo's famous portrait of her family. So we're talking about Mexico really beginning to change. The idea of local and foreign is still an important theme. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it out in such laborious historical detail initially, because I think we see this time and time and time again. I don't want to lose sight of this as we're moving forward to a more sort of events-based chronology of revolution and upheaval in Mexico. So during the Porfirian regime, we see incredible economic changes. It's primarily based on tropical exports, things like henequen for farm rope, sugar, vanilla. This is a time when people are starting to experiment ice cream for the first time, and vanilla explodes as a tropical export. And of course, ongoing things such as silver. Because this export boom is so continuous, and because Mexico has a privileged access not just to European markets, which it's beginning to exploit quite robustly, but a growing U.S. market also gives Mexico a pride of place if we're thinking about tropical exporters to emerging consumer cultures elsewhere. A little snapshot of the Porfirian economy. The GDP over this time is growing at around 4% a year, and in the final decades of the Porfirian economy, during the rule of the so-called científicos, of the social scientists who kind of imagine themselves with their hands on the various levers of policy and power and local coercion, pressing a little bit here, lightening up a little bit here. This was occurring not just in things such as taxation, public building, the projection of schools and so forth, the projection of courts of law, but also a very, very robust police force that managed elections. I think it's fair to say that it wasn't a full-on one-party dictatorship. It was a managed system where there were local elections, state-level elections, presidential elections at recurring intervals as proponents of a sort of Republican-based constitution would wish. But there's always local political bosses who are making sure that the voting rolls contain upstanding citizens who will vote the right way, and projected as well by or protected as well by a quite coercive and aggressive police force, the rurales, they were sometimes called in rural places, although there were many different aspects of this police force. Any correlation to the current U.S. election system is only incidental. It's receiving massive amounts of foreign investment precisely because the científicos with Porfirio at the top are able to manage a coercive system of intake and replacement. The debts are canceled first in London and then across the European banks, and we start to see the arrival of heavy industry. It just so happens that beer and cement were two of the ones that were the most robust as far as what was happening. The reason, and so there were in fact many industries that were quite important. The reason I wanted to mention these four, Cemex, Cruz Azul, Dos Equis Beer, and Tecate Beer, they're still around today. I was debating with folks here at the MFA whether I should do audience participation or not. I can't resist this one question. Dos Equis Beer, does anyone want to guess why the two X's, it's called 2X Beer. Anyone want to guess why it's called Dos Equis? 20th century. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So it was a beer that was built to inaugurate the 20th century. This scientific system looks perhaps great on paper. The científicos, I think, were quite proud of themselves for what they were achieving on paper in certain places in Mexico, certainly in Mexico City. This is where the urban landscape of Belle Epoque, Mexico City, I don't know if anyone's traveled there, the various palatial houses, museums, public buildings, this is where this is all coming online, and it's, of course, being fueled by Cemex cement. It's benefiting certain people who are self-confident enough to be able to take a picture of themselves riding an ostrich. But if we're talking about the wider population, not so much, in fact. 0.1% of the Mexican population controlled over half of the land. That shakes out to about 11,000 families. That might seem like a lot, but if we think about these families intermarrying, allying themselves, it's very easy to, especially over such a large territorial extent, that is the modern, although reduced, state of Mexico during the Porfirian years. Meanwhile, we have 97% of folks being landless. And this is particularly striking when the engine that's driving the Porfirian economy is agricultural tropical export produce. So to be able to have a hand in this game, in this booming game of tropical exports, you have to be able to have land title, which many people lacked. We still have a majority laboring, although things are getting so bad that people are beginning, or rather are agricultural laborers in the various export plantations across Mexico. Although this is beginning to shift as people are beginning to try their luck, either with heavy industry getting a job, and particularly in the north, close to Mexico, close to the U.S. border, or moving to the city and just trying their luck there, particularly Mexico City and a few others. I think the most striking figure, you guys have probably already seen this because I've had this slide up for a while, is 30% infant mortality. Babies are dying across Latin America at this time. And I think that there's something particularly shocking that the richest country in this region, with perhaps the exception of Argentina, although Argentina was somewhat cratering at this time, is that roughly a third of all children are dying by the age 3. This is, in fact, infant mortality at age 3. It's not to age 5. Nevertheless, Porfirio and the Científicos think things are good enough that they're going to have a gigantic celebration of lights to mark the 100th anniversary of Mexican independence. This is not the culmination of Mexican independence in 1821. It's the first shots fired against the Spanish regime. The idea of local and foreign is also central to this celebration. I love this particular photo of Porfirio Diaz and the invited delegation from Japan, because one of the things that he wanted to achieve in this Centennial Celebration in 1910 was to project Mexico as a part of the world, to define what Mexico might be as a consumable image to others. This is the famous sunstone. How many of you have seen this on a coffee mug or a T-shirt or a Mexican nationalist website or a Chicana website? Certainly very successful, Porfirio, in employing the large archaeological team responsible for this incredible excavation and analysis. And also, during this ongoing celebration of 1910, foreign dignitaries were arriving. It's something like a little mini World's Fair. It's not a World's Fair because, frankly, not everyone wanted to show up in Mexico City, but those who did were given the star treatment by Porfirio Diaz. Luscious banquets, full of light. I think the thing that's really striking about these centennial celebrations is just the amount of electrical power that's being spent for these celebrations. And even in, say, a more humble sweatshop, there's also commemorations. You know, people decide to put on their best to hang out with the boss. They have a pretty nice spread under the protective visage of Porfirio Diaz. This is 1910. I'd mentioned that there's a cadre of some 11,000 families that basically are holding not just the economic but the political reins in Mexico and benefiting extraordinarily from this ongoing export boom. One of the members of this elite is this gentleman here named Francisco Madero. I post him with this calavera because we're also seeing some important changes in Mexican art. I'm sure that you are familiar with this sort of skeletal calavera broadside. Raise your hand if you've seen this side of thing. Again, whether it's in a Museum of Fine Art or on a T-shirt or on some sort of trinket that you get at the Cancun airport. The idea of this calavera is from the artist Jose Guadalupe Posada, incredibly influential, a generation before Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, and quite more influential on Rivera, in fact, than Kahlo. I want to tell the story of Madero, however. Like many scions of this elite, he was sent to school away. He studied agriculture at Berkeley here in the United States, and came back with new ideas about irrigation for his gigantic cotton plantation in the north of Mexico. Estimates vary a little bit, but it's possible that, in fact, Madero was the largest landholder in Mexico at this time. Again, it's a little bit hard to tell, but certainly I could at least very confidently place him top 5. There's debate, particularly among younger members of the social scientists, of the científicos responsible for Mexican administration at this time, and also for more young and perhaps even idealistic scions of this family. There's beginning to be internal bickering about what happens after Porfirio dies. Diaz doesn't help matters in 1907 when he gives an interview to an American newspaperman named James Krillman, imagining himself stepping aside in 1910. Madero became very involved in the argument for an end to repeated re-election. Because what we've seen during the Porfirian regime is Diaz running time and time and time and time and time again and winning. And the simple idea that Madero was selling is an end to this process of re-election. And it's striking, in fact. I think I'm beginning to get up to talk about the Mexican Revolution. And I think one of the strongest ongoing effects of the Mexican Revolution is, in fact, the ongoing prohibition in Mexican politics for a president to be reelected. The Mexican president is never reelected, never. And this comes from the the Madero insurrection. Incidentally, Porfirio Diaz's claim to power initially was that Benito Juarez, his predecessor, was also re-upping himself too much in the presidency, that there needed to be a change, that there needed to be an end to re-election from Porfirio Diaz himself. Madero runs in the 1910 presidential election and wins the popular vote. However, administration is such that doesn't really matter. Diaz claims victory for himself and has Madero jailed. It's during the period of Madero being in jail that he issues a pronunciamiento. It's a term in Mexican political Spanish, a call to arms. And there's a series of these various calls to arms across the early 20th century, some successful, some not. The Madero call, in many places, was not answered. Practically everywhere in Mexico. There were two places where people rose up in arms. One is in the north, on the ongoing conflictive border between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. I think it's striking the role that Ciudad Juarez has played in the upending of modern Mexican politics. It's in fact quite striking. We have this very large army that grows out. It eventually comes to be called División del Norte, the Northern Division. And for a while, it's the largest standing it's the largest standing army anywhere in the Americas. I'm going to talk about it later. But what I wanted to say that's really striking here is we have really unexpected folks, especially around Ciudad Juarez, sort of rising up to Madero's call. There's this D.W. Hoffman guy who took some photos of, what it says here, Indians with Madero's army attempting to fight the really quite brutal Rurales police force with bows and arrows. Of course, that wasn't all. We have Pascual Orozco here. Where's my little pointer? Pascual Orozco, who begins to organize a hierarchical army with command and control to repulse and really start to attack territory in favor of Madero. Second in command, who becomes very, very important, is, of course, this guy, Pancho Villa. And here's two fixers, Garibaldi and Braniff, from these early years. The mirroring between local and foreign at Ciudad Juarez is incredibly striking because all of the logistical support is coming from a foreign place, coming from the United States, both from the Wilson government itself and also from various donations from Mexican communities and allies who see, for one reason or another, a desire to depose Porfirio Diaz after what was perhaps the most blatant of his, let's call it, a stolen election. There was also a bit of theater involved on this northern frontier. Here's another striking photo where we have, this is the Rio Bravo, or Rio Grande, and on one side here, Americans and insurrectos at Rio Grande. Here we have folks with parasols, right? Just sort of hanging out at river's edge, watching revolutionaries gather to go kill other people. It's really, really striking, the mirroring of local and foreign, where foreign becomes local and local becomes foreign. Farther south, here's some more caricatures from Zapata, or rather, from Posada of Zapata, Emiliano Zapata, initially called the Attila the Hun of the South, considered to be incredibly uncouth, drunken, womanizing lout. And no, you read the papers from that time, and that's kind of what they say, right? What can we do? Oh, I didn't mean it to have any sort of correlation to current politics. Yeah, there you go. Forgive me for that. I guess the drunkenness, Trump's something of a teetotaler, but anyway, the striking thing here is the ways in which we have different mobilizations. Just in a few minutes here, I'm going to talk about the really striking differences between Zapatismo, represented here by a woman riding ragged over helpless, fleeing skeletons, or Emiliano Zapata with his blood-drenched sword. This, however, proved to be enough. The Zapata stronghold initially in the state of Morelos, just south of Mexico City, allowed for there to be just enough of a chokehold on the eastern half of Mexico City that communication became uncomfortable, particularly farther to the east in Veracruz, the most important port, particularly when we're still remembering that this is an export economy. So not just the receipts of sale, but also the various import-export tariffs coming into Veracruz are really, really key for government functioning. A small Zapatista blockade on the road to Veracruz ends up to make quite a bit of difference to Porfirio Diaz. Additionally, an incredibly large and growing insurrection in the north, led initially by Pascual Orozco and soon enough by Pancho Villa, was also quite worrying, precisely, or especially as we start to see members of the police forces in the north beginning to say switch sides or to abandon their various posts. In fact, this scary continent or nationwide police force was really quite rotten, and we begin to see in the initial battles of the Mexican Revolution, we're now entering this period of ongoing revolution, or if you'd rather, Mexican Civil War. And it's really striking at this time to see the ways in which these lauded police captains really know absolutely nothing about fighting an open war against the División del Norte. One of the things, however, that does prove to be so we have Madero in power now, very, very briefly in power. One of the things that he has first in mind, again, and his initial support, Madero's initial support, as I'd mentioned, comes from two different areas. The Zapatistas immediately south of Mexico City, who are rebelling for their own reasons, and this ongoing insurrection in the north, División del Norte. One of the first investments of Madero, in fact, is in an air force. Does anyone want to guess who he wants to strafe with these planes? Zapatistas, exactly. I mentioned that the Zapatista claims for revolution are much different than a change at the top of government. And despite the fact that Madero came with, let's say, a rather robust reformist agenda, it was precisely that, a reformist agenda. It wasn't radical enough for the very, very local, specific demands of the Zapatistas. There was a very quick falling out between these two different sides, and in the matter of a few months, we see Madero launching airstrikes against the Zapatistas. However, Madero, the reformist, proved too radical for other aspects of the Mexican elite. If we think about these 11,000 families, the ways in which the Zapatistas are beginning to question the legitimacy of their title to land, that's famous call of land and liberty, Tierra y Libertad, from the initial Zapatista call to arms, coupled with the actual de facto invasion and capture of these incredibly large northern estates. Northern estates in particular were in the hands of many U.S.-derived families. They oftentimes had a deep history in Mexico themselves, but they also understood themselves in one form or another as American. In a certain sense, this is a little bit of a penumbra from the ongoing manifest destiny of the 19th century, where we see filibustering in places like Florida and Louisiana, the ongoing story of the Polk War for the West, the Texas Revolution and so forth. There's an ongoing penumbra of American landholding just across the Mexican border. It's oftentimes quite extensive. So they call up their friend, the U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson. Henry Lane Wilson, he's carrying a little bit more of the brunt in this story than he needs to, because it's always good to have an American scapegoat here. There's other processes going as well among members of the Mexican landholding elite that are also disillusioned with Madero. There's a conspiracy focusing around the head of Madero's bodyguard, a gentleman with the sunglasses named Venustiano Carranza. No, not that. Victoriano Huerta. And very, very quickly, in a matter of days, not just Huerta, but a series of other opposition forces, including Porfirio Diaz's nephew, named Felix, launch an all-out total war in Mexico City itself. It's called the 10 Tragic Days, the Cena Trágica, where upwards, it's in the tens of thousands, in fact, the casualties, just in the matter of these 10 days. I find this really striking in the story of the 10 tragic days, because we also see time and time and time again what we might consider to be an incredibly local fight here, under the, or in dialogue with Mexico opening in a new and surprising way to foreign beer, right? Ketelsen and Degetau. Sucursales is what that means right there. A chain of convenience stores selling liquor and other things by German migrants who perhaps are from a similar wave of the one that brought Guillermo Kahlo to become interested in spending the rest of his life in Mexico. We have this incredible surprise attack by the head of the bodyguards, Huerta, and very, very soon Madero and his vice president are in jail. A little fun fact, the Mexican National Archives is in fact now in the jail where Madero and Pino Suarez, his vice president, were kept. And if you want to request documents in the National Archive, they're in fact kept in the cells that prisoners used to hold. It's a really striking experience to be sipping, your designer coffee and requesting documents about the Mexican Revolution precisely from the places where the most despised political prisoners were held. Speaking about hatred, public hatred for rulers, we see the Huerta regime as a very, very, very fleeting instance where various patterns of Mexican oppositional politics unite in their hatred for this one individual. So despite the fact that the División del Norte and the Zapatistas are doing different things and concerned in many ways with different revolutionary transformations, they join forces together with a third group that I'll talk about a little bit later, from the one governor during the Porfirian regime who rose up against Porfirio Diaz. His name was Venustiano Carranza. We'll talk about Carranza a little bit later. Because initially, the two main armies, as I'm mentioning here, are the Zapatistas and the Villistas, the División del Norte. In popular culture, we start seeing the old La Cucaracha song being trotted out one time again. This is a very, very old satirical song. It was used in the 19th century against such despicable individuals as Santa Anna, the president who must have ruled for, I don't know, I'm picking it off the top of my head, at least 20 times perhaps. He'd go, he'd overthrow a government, he'd set up new ministers, he'd retire to his ranch. There was one period during the battle for Texas where he lost his leg. He erected a triumphal pillar to his martyred leg. So there was a lot of examples in the 19th century of satirical verses like La Cucaracha coming on against presidential power, against someone like Santa Anna. This comes out of retirement again, this song, La Cucaracha, ya no puede caminar. And then you change the verse. Porque no tiene, this is the new verse specifically directed at Huerta. Porque no tiene, porque le falta. Anyone know it? Marihuana que fumar, right? So one of the accusations, and there's a great recent work, in fact, about the Mexican war on drugs, where, believe it or not, the public prejudice against drug consuming that we think as such an American thing might in fact have had its influence in Mexican worries about similar patterns. That comes to the fore during the oppositional catcalls against Huerta. The Zapatistas, I'm going to talk about them a little bit now. Here we have the upstanding revolutionary Emiliano Zapata, the shorter one, and the drunken lout Eufemio, his older brother. They're both great generals. Zapata is issuing proclamations and organizing local resistance to various regimes, to Porfirio Diaz, to Huerta, and then to others that I'll mention later. Eufemio is a really, really good fighter, but not a liability in many other aspects. I wanted to mention this because we start seeing a conflation of what Zapatismo means. Nevertheless, at a local level, it means one thing in particular. It's about Emiliano, forgive me. This is a great photo of people lining up to hear Emiliano Zapata talk. The claims here are for local revolution. He says time and time and time again that he's not interested in national power. Rather, what he really desires above everything, as I've said before, land and liberty, tierra y libertad. He organizes these really effective guerrilla movements that take over plantation after plantation. It's mostly a sugar area where he's active in Morelos, and begins to spread a little bit into the east, into places like Puebla, just to the east of Mexico City. An incredibly robust movement that's hobbled by one particular thing, its feet. Unlike the División del Norte, the peasant Zapatista movement is all about local fighters who are walking places. So they're very, very, very effective cordoning off Mexico City when that needs to happen. However, when the Mexican Revolution explodes into a series of civil wars, they only participate in the areas where they have local bases, because not only do they not want to leave a domestic unit for too long, lest their corn die or someone, their goddamn neighbor take their land, not the goddamn plantation owner, but your revolutionary neighbor who, if you happen to vacate yourself for a couple of different months during a key year, might come back and find the land no longer yours. This is also a comparative lack of infrastructure. I've mentioned offhandedly that most Mexican exports were heading north to the United States increasingly across this period. So there's trunk lines, there's trains going north and south from Mexico City north. This is south of Mexico City, so there's not even trains that the Zapatistas could ride if they wanted to. Nevertheless, the Villistas, the Zapatistas come together and they expel Huerta from Mexico City. There's this famous photo, I don't know if anyone has seen this, of Zapatistas arriving for the first time at the lunch counter of this place called Sanborn's. It's still around in Mexico City. And experiencing for the first time this breach in social difference, that despite the fact, if you're riding a horse, you could get there in a matter of hours. This is the first time that these revolutionaries are sitting down at a lunch counter. Strikingly similar in some ways to our own different transformations of lunch counters in the 20th century here in the United States. This is what it looks like to the shop girls from the other side. Famous photo of Zapata and Pancho Villa sitting down in the presidential chair. I was looking for a YouTube video of Villa and Zapata sitting down with local administrators from this wouldn't be the Maderista, from the Huerta regime, but from the pre-existing Maderista regime, which is trying to reestablish itself as a reformist elite government. And if you find it on YouTube, it's great, because I couldn't find it, I'm not showing it. It shows these very, very debonair city intellectuals, very, very daintily drinking their tea and cutting with exquisite care their cuts of meat, whereas Villa and Zapata arrive without that experience of table manners, or perhaps trying to project different patterns of sociability. So they're wiping their sleeve across their mouth. They're sort of looking askance at all the weird people that they have to sit next to. It's a really remarkable bit of film. Interestingly, so I was talking a little bit about Zapata. Now I'm going to move over to Villa. Interestingly, Frida Kahlo did a portrait of Villa. Never painted Zapata. Her husband Diego Rivera was really into Zapata. Hardly ever painted Pancho Villa, but Kahlo was interested in Pancho Villa, at least in this one painting. Moving on to talk about the División del Norte, it was powerful enough to take over the major Mexican state of Chihuahua. And briefly, Pancho Villa was governor there. He established a really interesting, although incredibly short-lived, revolutionary government, issuing, you can see, his own currency, passing a series of labor laws, a series of land reform laws, attempting to project a new idea about education, attempting to project public schooling into places where it hadn't previously arrived. I feel like my time's getting a little bit tight, so I'm going to start talking a little bit faster. Please bear with me. So the División del Norte is famous for its sociability on top of trains. Here we have people pitching tents, and whereas people in the Zapatista movement didn't want to leave their domestic unit, the people in the División del Norte are taking the domestic unit with them on top of the train. It's actually quite interesting. Not only do we see families and so forth arriving with their changes of clothes, their rosaries, their holy Bibles, and everything else, sometimes they're also bringing dogs along as traveling companions. Underneath is, of course, where the horses are, the horses and the artillery. So people live on top, horses and guns below. If there's it's really very much a train-based pattern of war. This is, I mentioned before that there's a command hierarchy in the División del Norte that's inexistent in the Zapatista movement. Zapatista movement, local guerrilla movements that roughly correlate as various coalitions that form and break in Morelos. Here, people are wearing uniforms, they're receiving salaries and pensions and death benefits, at least while the Vista train is at full power. It's not always at full power. I'd mentioned that there's this third group that begins to start taking power around 1915, connected with Venustiano Carranza. I'll talk about the Carrancistas a little bit later. The reason I wanted to show this broken train, not just to talk about the ways in which the Pancho Villa experiment crashed quite soon after it launched, but also to mention that this is another really interesting form of fighting. They would rig a train with explosives, and if there was, let's say, a train station that they were trying to take, and they weren't that interested in the sort of casualties that they would inflict, or they were uninterested in the logistics that train station could support, they would take a train, load it with dynamite, open up the throttle all the way, and just let it crash into whatever obstacle it would hit. It was called a máquina loca. We have all of these romantic stories of the Mexican Revolution, this Sanga of La Adelita, these stories of dashing soldiers arriving in a town and a local woman falling for their new love and deciding to travel together with them. That's one of the stories of gender in this revolution. It's not the only one. Women, in fact, begin fighting from the beginning, particularly in the north, particularly in the División del Norte. It's really striking. This is the photo that I decided to share in our sort of handout. And the thing I think is striking not only is the badass look of this woman or her Afro-Mexican features, but check out the uniform, right, with medals and everything. So the idea of total war is really happening in the North in a way that is not even happening in the Zapatista realm. You go. There's thousands of photos of women carrying arms. This is one of them. Children are also carrying arms. One of the things that I think is striking about the Mexican Revolution, there's a certain romanticism to it, which I think this lecture is a little bit perpetuating. It's a rollicking story of the underdogs rising up. That's certainly part of it. There's also many, many unintended consequences flowing forth from this as well. Child soldiers is one. An incredibly high death toll is the other. This is my attempt to scavenge death tolls and sort of to put it in comparative context. So if we think about the ways in which death is a part of discourses in the U.S. about civil war, we have maybe about 4 times that in the Mexican Revolution, up there with perhaps the almost coterminous Soviet Revolution. This is sometimes what happened when you were on the wrong side of battle in Mexico at this time. If not, this is what happened. You became a refugee. And in fact, it's well known that many, many places in the United States have had Mexican majority populations since, frankly, the beginning. There are other places, however, that begin to see an absolute explosion of Mexican migration and Mexican migrant culture. I'm thinking particularly of my adopted home in Chicago. I'm here in Boston. I've been here 5 years. But I arrived wearing a Chicago sweater. And it's at this time that Chicago becomes the truly Mexican city that it is, in addition to a Polish city and a black city and everything else, a black metropolis. Many, many, many refugees either fleeing war or the threat of war. And in fact, arriving perhaps, estimates vary between 1 and 2 million across this decade between 1910 and 1920. And then the migrations continue into the 1920s. Now I'm going to finally talk about this third group, the Carrancistas. This is the bearded governor. You can tell that he's of the old school, the governor of Coahuila who rose up against Porfirio Diaz. Initially, his movement was local. It was important. It had some important generals, like this one-armed guy, Álvaro Obregón, this guy right here. Very, very handsome face, I'd say. And but initially, it wasn't the main force in the north, because Pancho Villa and the División del Norte was really running rampant over much of northern Mexican territory. One reason among many for this is the ongoing support of the Wilson administration through munitions and elsewhere, money to the Villista regime. Once Pancho Villa is in power and the Wilson regime starts to see how radical his propositions are, they begin to switch sides. They begin to favor, with arms and money, the Carrancistas. Not only with arms and money, also with troops. There's that famous Marine song, from the halls of Montezuma, right, to the shores of Tripoli. This is the halls of Montezuma. This is the U.S. invasion of Veracruz. I mentioned previously that Veracruz is really key for the economic stability of central governments, because it's the pinch point for European commerce. Not only for European commerce, it's also a great place to get guns, right? You can imagine how many guns are arriving in this particular flotilla. So we have very, very and increasingly strong U.S. support in favor of Carranza, and particularly to the detriment of Pancho Villa. There's a famous battle, the Battle of Celaya, where Obregón, this one-armed general, kicks Pancho Villa's ass. And since then, Pancho Villa is really in retreat. It's only after that period, after feeling a certain amount of betrayal from his U.S. allies, that Villa makes the famous raid into Columbus, New Mexico. I was going to talk about the telegram. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm getting into culture a little bit now. Carranza is able, and once Villa is out of the way, and the Zapatistas are sort of locked into a local fight, he can begin to make a play for national government, for national control. This is the Constitutional Convention convened under Carranza's auspices that wrote the Constitution that's still effective today, that's still active. It has some very important aspects. It expands citizenship and voting rights to a number of folks who don't receive it previously. However, goddamn Spanish has it be a gender, so when you say ciudadano with an O, that means masculine, and there's Supreme Court cases later on that decide that doesn't include women until a much later attempt that I'll talk about toward the end of this class. Land reform is another thing that's written into the Constitution in a somewhat discreet way compared to the propositions of both Villa and Zapata. We start to see a stability now because the Carrancistas control the port of Veracruz, they control much of the north and the northern trunk lines, they control Mexico City. So the south is still up in arms. The south of Mexico is still largely up in arms. But this trifecta of trains plus the pinch point of Veracruz plus the national capital begins to be enough for Carranza to begin to establish what becomes a national regime, what becomes the ongoing ruling dynasties of Mexico since then. This means that, among other things, markets begin to rebound incredibly robustly. It's striking, in fact, how fast consumer markets, both in the areas of Mexico under Carrancista control and also exports to the United States, rebound once Carranza is in power. I'm also thinking about oil as another important thing that Carranza was offering to the United States, to the Wilson regime, in exchange for money. It wasn't just a little bit more of a conservative ideology. It was also quite a bit of oil, I should say. We start seeing cars crowding Mexico City streets in a way that didn't happen before. I mention this only because Frida Kahlo herself, right, had this horrible bus accident where she was plowed into by one of these pedestrian cars. And that's one of the reasons why I want to share this. I'm, again, being a little bit briefer than I had intended. Eventually, after a few years of Carranza being in control, he conspires to assassinate Zapata. There he is. Zapata. And then he himself is offed by his one-armed general, Obregón. Right? Obregón becomes president in 1920, and this is when we start to see something like a post-revolutionary regime. It's always a fight among Mexican historians of Mexico, to say when in fact the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican Civil Wars ended, because fighting continues through the 20s, through the 1920s. But for a class like this, or for a lecture like this, let's just say 1920 with Obregón. Obregón hires, here he is in his presidential outfit, hires this guy whose back is to the camera, Jose Vasconcelos, to be the education minister. And one of the attempts by Vasconcelos to project a new regime, order has arrived, things are different now. This is nothing like the Porfirian regime, is hiring these famous muralists like Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, etc. It's during Rivera's post-revolutionary muralizing that he meets Frida Kahlo. I'll talk about Frida a little bit later on. But I want to talk about the wider education regime of Vasconcelos and his successors, because this is also an attempt of the Mexican state to project itself into new communities where it wasn't present before. So teachers are arriving not just to teach things, but to try and get a little bit of running water so that perhaps they can teach people about modern ideas of hygiene, both racial and cultural hygiene, in addition to washing your hands, physical education, and also sex ed. It's striking in the 1920s, the frankness that the new, let's call it revolutionary government, was attempting to project ideas of sex ed, both for, I would say, pretty compelling reasons, and also with just a little touch of eugenics in there, just for it to be early 20th century. We see striking political mobilization against sex ed and other things. And one of the things that's really striking in the 1920s is we see a flowering of local politics, oftentimes against the revolutionary regime that local politics at one time was supporting. So here we have a street protest against sex ed. The subsequent Minister of Education was named Bastos. Here's Bastos right there. And I love this particular phrase, down with sex ed, where they switch the X and the X for sex ed. Boycotts, oftentimes led by women, begin to spread across sections of Mexico. There's one particular area, encompassing states like Michoacán and Jalisco, that become a hotbed of revolutionary activity. This is sometimes called the Cristero War, or La Cristiada, where Catholic local soldiers fight against the Mexican government and its perceived impositions. One of these impositions, in fact, was to create a separate branch or separate dependent branch of the Catholic Church subsumed to the national hierarchy. So the Mexican Catholic Church, as not apostolic, not connected in to the hierarchies of Rome, but a local form of Catholicism projected by, I'm going forward just to have a little bit more time, projected by, where is he? Too far ahead, sorry. He's the guy doing the Hitler salute right here. Where is he? Plutarco Elias Calles. Two other things that are important. We have, so the revolutionary response by Obregón and Calles was striking. The idea that these two had is that, okay, if we can't do re-election, we'll do a two-step. So it'll be Obregón president for 4 years, and then it'll be Calles president for 4 years. And then it'll be Obregón again, and then it'll be Calles, and then it'll be Obregón. And it eventually starts extending out to 6 years soon thereafter. But it's during the Cristero War that Obregón is assassinated by a Catholic insurgent, by a sympathizer of the Cristero cause. And in retaliation, we have a very, very strong response by the Calles government. This is something like early 20th century Mexican modernity, right? Where we have a train track bringing modernity and progress, and just in case you're on the right side, a series of cadavers, not just one, hung from the lamppost, which is another, or hung from the electrical wires, which is another certainly modern arrival in many places during this time. We also see radical elements organizing. This is a famous, really, really compelling mobilization, in fact, against the Catholic clergy in southern Mexico. The projection of schools I've already talked about. Lola Alvarez Bravo is a really, really great photographer, and she took some of these photos. The projection of schools, not just as I think you guys are perhaps familiar with the idea of schools not just as teaching ABC arithmetic, but also teaching an idea, a very, very particular idea of civics. So this is something that's also arriving in the education regime of the 1920s, of which Diego Rivera is somewhat a part. The biggest transformation for me of the Mexican Revolution is this, however. The arrival of corn mills in local towns. It's estimated that before these gas-powered or electric corn mills arrived in local towns, women would spend, let's say, perhaps 6 hours a day preparing corn, soaking it, salting it, grinding it, patting it into a tortilla, patting it into a tamal, something else that's really tasty. And it's after and I love this particular quote from the Codex Borgia, perhaps one of the most important pre-Columbian documents. It was backbreaking work back then too, right? This constant grinding on top of the metate. So you're freeing up anywhere between 5 and 6 hours of women's time after about 1930 with the arrival of these government-sponsored corn mills in small towns. Women use this new leisure time in all sorts of different ways. I was going to read this rather coy young letter by Frida Kahlo. This is what she used to look like, but I'm not going to spend the time because we're getting close to our end. We have the consolidation of the Calles government, first in the National Revolutionary Party, the Mexican Revolutionary Party, Institutional Revolutionary Party. This is currently the governing party in Mexico, and it had been between the Calles years of the late 1920s and 2000. He was deposed by Lázaro Cardenas. Here he is as a young soldier. Here he is as a swashbuckling president. There's some jokes about Cardenas where the economic minister would say, "Where's the president?" And it would be, "Oh, he can't come to our key national economic planning meeting because he got a letter from a local peasant that the donkey was sick." So the public charisma of Cardenas was really, really true. However, he ended up ceding a fair amount of control to his administrators in the PRI. Right? Going forward, I'm going to expropriation. Frida Kahlo goes to the United States. Many things I want to talk about. I want to finish with one story though, because I know my time is running short. So here's a bunch of very compelling slides you can ask me about later. Frida Kahlo in Detroit. Diego Rivera painting people, painting multitudes. Frida Kahlo painting individuals. Here we have her in her sickbed painting the photo that I had quoted previously. She has some love affairs with Trotsky and his secretary. She then decides that she's going to go Stalinist. This is her last painting in the Casa Frida Kahlo in Mexico City. We start seeing popular culture arriving in crazy different ways. The Three Caballeros from Disney's Goodwill Tour. There's this great comedian named Cantinflas. Raise your hand if you've heard of Cantinflas. Ah, great. So there's one of my favorite episodes, or one of my favorite films of his, is called Por Mis Pistolas, where there's a part where he's talking about migration, because again, this idea of local and foreign is blending in a new way after the revolutionary period in Mexico. Not only with refugees, but also with patterns of trade, and by the 1950s, the Bracero program, specific patterns of labor transfer. There's this one scene in Por Mis Pistolas where he's trying to cross the U.S. border. There's a lock here. The border agent is saying, "I can't let you in." He eventually convinced the person to come in, and then he loses his keys. Cantinflas then produces a local. You've seen this film, I see, where he produces a key. He said, "I have the special Mexican key. I have the special key made in Mexico that only works on U.S. locks." Right? There's this great sense of humor, and then Then he has his donkey with him, and the agent won't let the donkey through, and then so Cantinflas declares the donkey as a family member and is then able to get a visa. Really, really great stuff. This illustrates Cantinflear, this idea of an individual response to institutional craziness. Because we do have many new institutions arriving in Mexico at this time, it was kind of imagined that it might work Diego Rivera style, where everyone is going toward a particular goal. It ended up being more Frida Kahlo style, where there's all sorts of crazy individual adaptations to oftentimes baffling modern situations. You have to Cantinflear. You have to make up gibberish and babble to get your way through. Mickey Mouse smoking a cigar, Cantinflas again, doing his skew on the sunstone, individual art, Frida Kahlo dies. Esther Chapa. So I talked about the Mexican Constitution and the fact that because it ends in an O, that women were denied the vote. During the Cardenas presidency, there was a movement, a judicial movement that would reform the Constitution. And in 1937, it was approved. Esther Chapa had to spend 22 years writing letters for that constitutional amendment to be simply published in the official journal, the official, what would be called in English? Like the official U.S. code, to be published as official law, to be promulgated. So the law was passed in 1937, but it wasn't until 1952, in fact, that the vote was given to women, right around the time that Frida Kahlo was dying. Similarly, we have a Mexican chemist, Luis E. Miramontes, synthesizes one of the main components for birth control. So we start seeing, again, a major transformation in women's lives coming in a very, very important way out of Mexico. I wanted to finish with Frida Kahlo a little bit, and one of her models. I think it's translated, the name of the thing translates in English is like My Nurse and Me, or my nursemaid and me. And this face, it belongs to an individual named Luz Jimenez. I think that Luz stands as a really striking counterpoint to a lot of what Frida Kahlo was doing. These are two experiences, two experiments of modern Mexican femininity, or of women, Mexican women who define as such, oftentimes in these very, very gendered roles, navigating these new structures that I just gestured at in this talk. So she's born in this indigenous community called Milpa Alta, which is actually part of the federal district in Mexico City, which means it's great for artists, because you can go dip your toe into an indigenous community without spending too much time riding a horse, or like you might get sick, or if you want to like go to your friend's birthday party, or go out to a really nice movie, and the weekend you can still get back from Milpa Alta in time. And this is where she's from. Her life was upended during the revolutionary period. The Zapatistas come in and they're not nice in Milpa Alta. Rape, pillage, everything you might imagine. It's not Emiliano Zapata, but it's a local group affiliated with that movement. And she arrives in Mexico City as a refugee, as an internally displaced person, attempting to, being a very, a real self-starter, really striking in her attempts to push herself forward into Mexican modernity. She auditions and wins an Indigenous Beauty Contest for the Museum of Fine Art in Mexico City, and she begins to sit for painters. Here she is. One of her first was by this painter named Fernando Leal. There's Luz Jimenez right there. And look, it's Zapatistas, the people who made her life living hell, are among the first that are incorporated into this national projection of a new revolutionary Mexican state. There's another interesting guy named Jean Charlot. If we're talking about going and coming back from Mexico, his parents emigrated to France. He was born in France, then he came back to Mexico on his own. Here's Luz Jimenez in his paintings. Here she is hanging out with members of the sort of left intelligentsia and the artistic community in Mexico City. Her life goes on. She gives birth in a traditional way in the Temazcal, in the indigenous sweat bath. This, in fact, is a photo of Tina Modotti. You know, we have a new gallery with Frida Kahlo and her circle, and it's splattered with Tina Modotti photographs. And in fact, I wanted to note that there's one called Baby Nursing, where it's just a baby and a breast. And I'm not sure, I'm not an art historian, but that kind of looks like it might be Luz Jimenez that the photo is of. Diego Rivera starts painting her as well. Here's another Rivera painting of Luz Jimenez. Once she gives birth, she starts to really represent the idea of generic indigenous Mexican womanhood. And particularly when Diego Rivera gets the contract to paint the National Palace. She's all over everywhere. Despite the fact that she's given a robust frame in this painting, and she's portrayed as slim, it's actually, once you sort of get a little idea of what Luz Jimenez looks like in Condesa neighborhood. Has anyone been to Condesa? It's a really, really beautiful Belle Epoque neighborhood in Mexico City. There's this fountain there's this fountain called the Lindbergh Fountain, and there's this woman, this naked woman holding two pitchers. It's Luci Mendez. Jean Charlot describes her as the Earth Mother. Edward Weston took a photo of her naked. I decided not to show that and just show pervy Edward Weston there. She described herself as a model, as nothing more than a big flower pot. It's at this time that Frida Kahlo starts painting her. And again, this is not attributed officially, although for me, the pitch of the face here is really striking, particularly when you put it up against Jean Charlot's Earth Mother right here. So I'm not an art historian. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but that really looks like Frida Kahlo putting herself at Luci Mendez's tit. And also, Jimenez stood or sat as Kahlo's model in her 1942 masterclass at the Mexican Museum, or the Mexican Fine Arts Academy. Here she is hanging out with other people. I'm not going to talk about this. I wanted to focus mostly on art. She then becomes an informant for a very important historian named Barlow, the linguist Benjamin Whorf. I don't know if anyone was familiar with Benjamin Whorf. He had some ideas about Nahuatl, informed entirely by his conversations with Luci Mendez. Later on in her life, she becomes a newspaper reporter. Barlow founds Mexica Itonalama, an indigenous language newspaper. She becomes a reporter for this. She hangs out in increasingly anthropological circles and starts publishing her own stories, her own life history. This was translated into the U.S. Life and Death in Milpa Alta. She continued to be incredibly active intellectually well into the 1960s. Frida Kahlo was maimed by Mexican traffic, and Luci Mendez was killed by it. 1965, she was hit by a car and died. So that's the end of the talk. Frida Kahlo and, what is it, Revolution and Upheaval in Kahlo's Mexico.
I have a couple questions.
Questions? Do you call or do I call?
Whoever puts their hand up, either one of us. All right here in the middle. I'm going to pass.
There was so much happening politically during the period you covered, and you kind of zipped through. There was so much that you had to go very quickly.
Yeah.
I guess this is a question maybe for you, but maybe for you. Are we going to revisit this later in the course to go a little bit more deeply into aspects of the political and social upheaval of the times?
I mean, I think it certainly will be touched on in other lectures, but we have a lot to cover in the entire series. So I would say this was kind of our chance to get the historical take. So I think if there are follow-up questions,
Let me say that there's a bibliography on the back of the thing that, if you want just something that's a rip-roaring read, the John Womack is published in the 70s, or I think 69, but it's copyright 70. It's still a really great read for a sort of a feel of the danger and promise of the Mexican Revolution. There's a series of others that are also really good, oftentimes life and times biographies.
Okay, thank you.
Were the very wealthy 0.11% of Mexico mainly European or indigenous?
So one of the things
was that an issue?
One of the things that I wanted to do is kind of trouble this idea of a fixed identity. Certainly, there is a color scale where folks who tend toward whiter skin are privileged. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why late arrivals on the scene with uncomfortable colors, like Porfirio Diaz, start powdering their face. I think it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of the ruling families consider themselves to be primarily of some sort of European extraction. Whether that is true is an entirely different question. And in fact, there's a lot of commentary, a lot of research, in fact, showing the various genealogical fictions that were perpetrated across centuries to be able to convince people that they were European and not something else. And I will say as well that there's a very, very strong and very powerful American expat community that is markedly English-speaking and so forth.
Hi, thank you for your lecture today.
Yeah.
Due to time constraints, I can appreciate how you needed to accelerate the pace of the slides.
Yeah,
And one
forgive
caught
me.
my eye that was in Frida Kahlo's hand. It was a letter. I was just wondering if there was, in the contents of that letter, is there something to inform us on her position during these tumultuous times?
Okay, well, let me get it. Where's the letter? This is one of the first letters from, what we could have of, and this is my translation. I gave us some primary documents, other translations, and I using the Spanish, so I would imagine that I translated differently than others. It's about Frida Kahlo wanting to get a job and having to learn typing skills. She's writing to a friend and looking for a hookup to be able to enter a new profession in the 1920s. One of the things that's really interesting in Frida Kahlo's language, we talk about almost all about her graphic communication skills, but her language is really interesting as well because initially we have these very kind of formal Spanish patterns, and as she goes through her life by the 1930s and 40s, she's incorporating Mexican street slang in a way that's really, really striking. And I had briefly, in this discussion, a talk on Frida Kahlo's slang. I can read off my cell phone to you some of her choice quotes, but we can do that after class. Why did I say class? I'm sorry, I had to cancel a class to come here. So this is why I have this default, forgive me, after the lecture. If you want to come and see how Frida Kahlo talks like a busker in 1930s, 1940s Mexico, I have some of that.
Great, thank you so much for coming today, and thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you.